Today is just a general overview of the Monarch CCAA, especially for Departments of Transportation. We will be talking about decision-making, the requirements for enrolling in the CCAA, the resources that we have available. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be spending a large part of it mostly on discussion, so we can answer your questions, and then we can talk and see what we can learn from each other. Your presenters today are myself. My name is Caroline Hernandez, and I'm at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois Chicago. I'm joined by Megan Petraitis, who is also at the University of Illinois Chicago, and then Dan Salas at Stanford. I want to also thank Arizona DOT, Minnesota DOT, PennDOT, and Federal Highways Administration for helping to plan and put this webinar on. So they've done a lot of the back end work, so we can make this as useful and comprehensive as possible. To get started, we know that the monarchs are in decline. Back in December of 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service told us that the monarch butterfly was warranted for listing as a threatened or endangered species, but it was precluded due to other immediate higher concerned creatures that needed to be listed. So that was something, through that we were able to recognize that they are worried about the monarch butterfly, they are thinking about listing it, and we now are expecting a listing decision of November of next year. And they have, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has emphasized that there are plenty of opportunities for voluntary conservation to help protect the monarch butterfly and potentially make impacts on the need for that listing decision as threatened or endangered, and potentially impacting the populations in the future. We get a lot of questions of what a monarch listing could look like as a threatened or endangered species. You know, we can't tell you this is exactly what it's going to look like, but we can look at other listing decisions for other pollinators or similar species to the monarch butterfly and make some educated guesses. We can guess that there are going to be take prohibitions around milkweed and nearby nectar resources. And of course, this is going to mean added costs and risks to land managers across the United States. There are going to be there will be need for increased Section 7 consultations for federal permits, increased need for Section 10 take permits. Of course, organizations are going to have to consider, there might be avoidance and minimization measures that organizations are going to have to take into account. And then, of course, there's going to be added time for coordination and documentation for all of these permits and AMMs for land managers. So we have tried to take that into account when we created the Monarch CCAA. And we've also heard questions about a potential 4D rule. And what we are expecting from a potential 4D rule is that it would still likely be restrictive, but enough to avoid harm to monarchs and their habitat, and to still promote conservation. So we are cognizant of that and thinking about that as well. So all of that said is why we worked with over 40 partners to create the Monarch Candidate Conservation Agreement Assurances. This is a voluntary agreement where organizations can choose to enroll prior to the listing decision, and they can and they are committing to creating and conserving habitat along their rights of way. So then they are also receiving that regulatory certainty that if there is a listing decision, they won't be asked for additional conservation measures or those additional take permits, and then they get that operational flexibility that regardless of any kind of litigation around a listing decision, they can continue on with what activities they're doing and what conservation measures they're already implementing. We're going to get into more details about all of that in the next. But so this is, again, voluntary agreements that organizations can do before the listing decision, and hopefully save some of that time and energy and risk that they might otherwise have with a listing decision. So that I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about decision making for the CCAA.
Hey, thanks, Caroline. And thanks everybody for joining us today. If you go to the next slide, especially if you're getting familiar with the CCAA for the first time, I wanted to kind of introduce some terminology because you'll hear us talk about this a lot, and it's something that's sort of foundational to the CCAA, which is thinking about what we call enrolled lands versus adopted acres. And so we have this graphic there on the left that you can see sort of a schematic of a section of roadway where, if we think about enrolled lands, we typically think about that as being sort of the areas where, for the purpose of the CCAA, where you'd be seeking that incidental take coverage. And so that could be sort of the full extent of your system. It could be certain parts of your system. And this example is sort of looking, for like an interstate or a highway, sort of fence to fence, everywhere, because we could have potential for milkweed, kind of within that whole spectrum of the roadway. And then I want to contrast that with adopted acres. Adopted acres are specifically the portions of the system where conservation measures are implemented and then tracked and then reported on as part of the commitments of the CCAA. So oftentimes these end up being sort of, the back slope areas or more naturalized portions of roadsides. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of what those requirements are as we go on. But as you think about what to enroll, where to enroll, you have the ability to sort of define that and define that across your system, sort of where you want that to occur, whether you want the entire full system. We certainly have many DOTs that have enrolled their entirety of their highway system, in the agreement. We have some that have enrolled portions of their system. But one thing to think about is that as new construction, new construction is built, and then as a consequence, after it's built, becomes eligible for enrollment in the CCAA, you can also add in lands after you're enrolled. So there is some flexibility over time to sort of adjust those enrolled acres as you go on. And then depending on the types of roadways that are enrolled, there's actually different levels of what we call adoption rates. So the things that we use to determine the amount of adopted acres you have to commit to in the agreement based on the type of road. And we broadly sort of categorize that by county and local roads at 5%, and then highways and interstates at 8%. And I realize that not everybody's road classifications always fit cleanly into those, sort of buckets. So we do allow you to sort of, as you're applying to the CCAA, make a determination and a suggestion on where you think some of your road classifications might fall within that. If you go to the next slide. As you're thinking about enrolling in the CCAA, I wanted to make this point clear. It does take time to do that. And you can see this table on the right that we have. This is sort of, from working with various partners, and kind of looking at sort of the course of the partnership. It takes time if you're starting to think about enrolling in the CCAA, right? The first part is building that team buy-in, that coordination, making sure everybody's on the same page that this is something you want to pursue. And then oftentimes there's discussions internally over, well, what would implementation take? How would we do that? Is it feasible for us? And so hopefully many of you have already started those conversations, are kind of going through that, because that can take some time even before you get to the stage where you're ready to prepare an application. And then depending on, again, how large your system is, how many people are involved, that application preparation could be fairly straightforward, or it could take a fair bit of time. All that kind of leading up to the fact that you're actually getting that application together and then submitting that to Fish and Wildlife Service, for their review, or sorry, to UIC and Fish and Wildlife Service for their review and their approval. So, if you roll up, these timeframes in here that I've just kind of really ballparked, that's anywhere from 6 to over 12 months for going from sort of the initial stage to enrollment in the agreement. And so think about where your organization is at on those, on this kind of spectrum, or these different sort of milestones, as it were, or phases of enrollment. And think about that, because like as Caroline mentioned, we're expecting a proposal to come out about this time, or for fall of 2023. And so that doesn't leave a whole lot of time to sort of start doing this. We don't really want to wait. So if you go to the next slide, to kind of drill this down a little bit into, once you've submitted your application, and if you've been working on this and you have something ready to prepare, you submit that to UIC, and then it undergoes a review for completeness by UIC. Once they do that initial review, the portions that are sort of related to the Section 7 analysis of the application goes to Fish and Wildlife Service for their review and their sign off. Before that comes back to UIC to finalize the review, there might be additional needs for clarification, or if there's details needed, there might be some discussions there. But once the application is complete and signed off by both UIC and Fish and Wildlife Service, UIC issues that draft certificate of inclusion to you for your organization to sign and return to UIC for them to confirm, that signatures are there, that the first year administrative fee has been paid, and then at that point, enroll you into the agreement. So, again, that can take a few weeks to months, depending on the scale of your enrollment and the complexity that's involved there. But just want to provide some of those details there. And so if you look ahead to the next slide, looking ahead to, again, the time frames for the listing decision that's coming up. We had that warranted but precluded determination back in 2020. And certainly, we've had a couple of years now of monarch population numbers. Of course, there's the crash, and then a little bit of a rebound out west, although still, even with that a little bit of a rebound we had last winter, it's still 99% population loss from what we had historically. So that population is still in trouble and needs the type of conservation that's promoted here through the CCAA. But when we look at the population overall, there hasn't been a whole lot of change since that initial warranted listing was made back in 2020. And so we're anticipating there likely to be a listing proposal November of next year. And of course, Fish and Wildlife Service has up to a year to make that proposal final, and then typically about a month for that final rule to take into effect. So we could be looking at a listing taking effect at the end of 2024 into the start of 25. And so with it taking some time to get an application prepared and in for the CCAA, my takeaway is I want to encourage you to think about doing that sooner than later. So with more details on some of the requirements and what's involved with the CCAA, I'm going to pass it over to Megan.
Thanks, Dan. So now that you're potentially in the Monarch CCAA as enrolled, there are some requirements to being in the program. So on that set of adopted acres, you'll be required to do conservation measures on those acres. So it could be one of 7 different conservation measures that we have laid out. So these are things that both create and protect pollinator habitat, monarch butterfly habitat on those adopted acres. So things such as creating milkweed and native flowering by planting seeds, planning your mowing or brush removal around the migratory schedule of monarch butterflies, or targeting your herbicide to avoid using herbicide on milkweed and native plants, managing your lands using grazing or burning or other management practices that promote this habitat. Also, if you have land that's that's already has good monarch butterfly habitat on it, just setting it aside and leaving it alone are all conservation measures that are allowed within the program. So just to spell out what those conservation measures are, I have them listed out here. So once again, that's seeding and planting to restore and create habitat, controlled grazing to promote habitat, brush removal, prescribed burning, suitable habitat, idle lands or set-asides, conservation mowing to enhance floral resource habitat, and target herbicide treatments. Once you're enrolled and you're doing your conservation measures on your adopted lands, we need a way to see what kind of progress there is throughout the years. So that's where effectiveness monitoring comes in. So this is monitoring that will be done on a yearly basis. There's a little bit of a split depending on where your DOT is on the map. So there is a requirement for the Midwest and Northeast to have about 6 stems or more per sample plot. Or if you're in the West and South, there's also there's a 2 stem or more per sample plot. So this is just to see if you're meeting those targets. And if you're not, then we go into something called adaptive management, but it's not a bad thing. It's just how are we going to, improve the number of stems on your land. So as you're doing this monitoring and seeing how much milkweed is on your land, we can kind of assess and go from there. And also addressing how many flowering nectar plants are present across, especially in the West and South. This is an optional data point for the Midwest and Northeast. So for flowering plants, we're looking for 10% in the sample area. And so this effectiveness monitoring, as I mentioned, is done on an annual basis and is done within that subset of your adopted acres. So another requirement in the program is we do have an annual report that is required to be submitted every year. So this report is something that is an online form, and it summarizes what you've done throughout the year, what kind of conservation measures have you done on your land, those monitoring results, and potentially adaptive management if needed. So this is done through an online form that we've put together where you're also where you will also submit your effectiveness monitoring spreadsheets. We have lots of resources on how to put this together. We usually host a help desk and have recordings. So it's something that we really try to support this time of year, and it's due at the end of January. And then another thing, just so you're aware, there is also an administrative fee that comes along with being a part of the program. So these are fees that are paid first at around the time the CI is issued, along with the application fee. The application fee is a one-time fee just for that first year, and then administrative fees are paid yearly around the time your CI was fully executed, signed by both parties. Unless you have a different schedule you'd like to follow, we can also work with you on that. So this fee we can also grant some discounts if you exceed your minimum adopted acres. So if you do conservation measures on even a larger quantity of acres than is required. And we also have some supplemental measures such as additional monitoring or promoting or having certain objectives in your vegetation management plans, things along those lines. There is some documentation that's required for those supplemental measure discounts. So just so you're aware, there is a way to reduce your administration fee. And on the toolkit, there is the fee calculator there that you can use to kind of estimate what this fee will be. And we're also happy to help confirm that estimation for you. And I think with that, I'm passing it over to Caroline.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so we understand that was a whirlwind of information. Thankfully, we have a full Monarch CCAA toolkit to get you started. And of course, we're always here to answer questions. But Rebecca, if you could put the working group, what is the word I'm looking for? Website into the chat, I would appreciate it. But here we have our just general Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website. And you can find more information at this Monarch CCAA dropdown. So you can learn generally about the Monarch CCAA. You can see who is enrolled and how many conservation acres we have. You can watch webinars and case studies. And then you can access all of the tools and resources at our Monarch CCAA toolkit. So in this toolkit, of course, you can find the full Monarch CCAA. And you can also download any of these resources like the application, what Megan mentioned, the CCAA fee calculator, guidance resources, decision support tools, going back to some of the stuff that Dan was talking about. When is the best time to enroll? What's the cost versus the benefit of it? And we also have some talking points. So say you're involved and you're excited about the CCAA, but maybe your management isn't. We've got some internal talking points, things like that. So I'd really encourage you to poke through the toolkit if you're interested on what implementation looks like, or you've got questions about the landowner coordination. We have everything that you can imagine. And if we don't have it, please reach out because we would be happy to create something or work with you on any tools or resources you need. We also have short video tutorials. So this is just a brief overview and introduction to the CCAA, but we've got one on the application, how to do the administrative fee, determining those enrolled lands, and more. So I would also encourage you to check these out. They're typically less than 10 minutes, and they're pretty specific. And so again, check out this toolkit. And if you go to, thank you, Rebecca, if you go to some of the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website, you can go straight to the Monarch CCAA toolkit that way, or you can log in and go to the toolkit through Working Group Access, where it's always been as well. So let us know if you have any issues accessing that, and if you have any questions. And here it is. So once you're registered, you've got the Working Group Access there, and that's all.